This morning, the Princess of Wales back on the global stage. Kate's first international trip since her cancer recovery, stepping out on her own, a research trip of sorts, learning about a cause she cares deeply about.
Thousands of people have packed the square. People are hanging out the windows, and you can see her right here meeting some of her littlest.
Princess Catherine has just stunned the entire United Kingdom by halting the Coronation Anniversary ceremony in a single devastating moment, breaking a solemn promise she had guarded in silence for over a decade, a promise made in the quiet grief of a young mother-to-be, who had once stood before a portrait of a woman she never met and whispered a vow into the empty air of Kensington Palace. For years, the Princess of Wales had played the role assigned to her by the ruthless machinery of the palace. The composed, the dutiful, the smiling, the impossibly gracious, swallowing every private cruelty behind the aristocratic composure the institution demanded. But something catastrophic, something so precisely engineered, so surgically calculated, so venomous in its symbolism, unfolded inside Westminster Abbey 5 minutes ago, that even her legendary restraint shattered like frost-covered glass beneath a hammer. What exactly did Princess Diana predict about this very tiara, this very anniversary, this very woman, in a private letter sealed with crimson wax and buried inside a mahogany box at Althorp House? Why did the late Princess of Wales explicitly forbid, in writing, in her own trembling hand, that this specific diadem ever again touch the head of any woman inside the House of Windsor? And what dark hidden tragedy from the summer of 1996, a tragedy so suffocating, so agonizing, so meticulously concealed by the men in gray, finally compelled Catherine to abandon 3 decades of institutional silence and halt the monarchy in front of 22 million viewers watching live across the globe? The morning had begun with the deliberate, almost liturgical calm that Westminster Abbey wore like a second skin. A pale silver light filtered through the great stained glass windows above the nave, dust motes drifting like slow-moving constellations through beams that had witnessed every coronation, every wedding, every funeral since the year of our Lord 1066. Outside, a biting May wind swept along the frost-touched stones of the Abbey's ancient courtyard, and the crimson-liveried footmen stood in perfect formation, their gloved hands folded, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Inside, the scent of aged parchment, candle wax, and cold marble mingled with the faint perfume of white gardenias. Diana's flower, always Diana's flower, arranged in towering silver urns along the transept. The mahogany choir stalls, polished to a mirror sheen, reflected the gilded ceiling above, and the Persian rugs laid across the sanctuary floor carried the muted footfalls of the arriving dignitaries. Every camera, every satellite uplink, every encrypted broadcast feed had been calibrated for a single purpose that morning, to project unity, continuity, and the untouchable grandeur of the crown. The Coronation Anniversary was to be a polished tableau of duty, a reassurance to a fractured nation that the institution endured, that the monarchy healed, that the past had been quietly folded away into the archives of history where it belonged. And then Queen Camilla stepped forward, and everything changed. Catherine saw it first. Of course she did. Her eyes had been trained by years of unforgiving scrutiny to catch every detail, the angle of a brooch, the placement of a sash, the historical weight of a jewel. She was seated in the second row of the sanctuary, dressed in a cream-colored gown embroidered with delicate silver thread, a modest sapphire brooch pinned above her heart. Her hands, gloved in ivory silk, rested motionless on her lap. Beside her, Prince William sat with the rigid posture of a man who had spent his entire life performing composure. Their children, dressed in miniature formal attire, were seated further along the row, their small faces solemn beneath the vaulted ceiling. And then, as the Queen Consort proceeded down the nave toward the high altar, the light from the eastern window caught the diadem upon her head, and Catherine's breath hitched, a single sharp intake so quiet that only William, seated inches away, heard it. She had recognized it instantly. The delicate scrollwork of platinum, the 17 graduated pear-shaped diamonds, the tiny sapphire cabochon set at the very center, a piece so distinctive, so intimately known, that no one who had ever studied the private jewels of the late Princess of Wales could possibly mistake it. It was Diana's tiara, not one of the loaned pieces from the royal vault, not a Cambridge lover's knot, not a Spencer heirloom worn openly at state occasions. This was the private diadem, the one Diana had commissioned herself in the winter of 1994, the one she had explicitly bequeathed with sealed instructions to be kept forever in a locked vault at Althorp. The one she had, in her own trembling hand, forbidden any Windsor woman from ever wearing. Catherine's face shifted. It was a change so subtle that 99% of the watching world would have missed it. A fractional tightening at the corners of her mouth, a slow blink, a paling of the color beneath her carefully applied composure. But William saw it, and in the same instant so did the cameras. 22 million viewers watching live across BBC One, Sky News, CNN International, and 100 smaller broadcasters saw the Princess of Wales freeze in her seat, as if she had been struck. In the control room 3 floors beneath the Abbey, a producer named Edward Hollis, a man in his late 50s, sweat prickling at his collar despite the cold, leaned toward his monitor and whispered a single word into his headset. Cut. But the encrypted feed did not cut. Somewhere in the labyrinthine communications network of the palace machinery, someone had already locked the broadcast open, and the signal continued to travel out across the satellites, into homes, into pubs, into offices, into airports where travelers stood frozen before departure screens. Across pubs in Edinburgh, pint glasses froze midair. In a small cafe in Cardiff, a barista stopped mid-pour. In a Kensington drawing room, an elderly duchess set down her teacup with a soft, trembling click. The nation held its breath. Catherine rose. She did not rise abruptly. She rose with the deliberate, glacial grace that had defined every public moment of her 22 years inside the House of Windsor. But there was steel beneath the silk now, a quiet, terrifying resolve that made the Archbishop, halfway through his ceremonial invocation, falter and fall silent. William was on his feet a half-second later, his hand instinctively reaching for her elbow, his eyes wide with a mixture of alarm and something else, something that looked, to those who knew him best, like relief, as if he had been waiting for this moment, as if he had known on some deep-buried level that it was coming. Catherine did not look at Camilla. She looked past her, up toward the high altar, toward the great crucifix that hung suspended above the sanctuary, and then she turned her head slowly, deliberately, toward the row of senior courtiers standing along the north transept, the men in gray, charcoal suits, polished Oxford shoes, clipboards clutched in white-knuckled hands, cold eyes that had for decades engineered every choreography of every royal event, every seating arrangement, every jewel selection, every diplomatic gesture. And at the center of them, standing slightly apart, was a man whose name Diana had written in her own hand 30 years ago. A man who was, in that moment, already reaching for the encrypted communications device clipped inside his jacket. 26 years earlier, in the sweltering August heat of 1997, a 9-year-old boy had sat cross-legged on the cool stone floor of the Kensington Palace Library, watching his mother pace back and forth before the tall mullioned windows. The scent of white gardenias had drifted in from the garden, and the grandfather clock in the corner had chimed the hour with its slow, deliberate rhythm. Diana had been holding a cream-colored envelope in one trembling hand and a silver fountain pen in the other. "William, my darling," she had said, her voice soft but weighted with something the boy did not yet understand. "If anything ever happens to me, if anything ever happens, you must promise me that you will never let them wear it. Not any of them. Not her, especially not her." William had not known then who her was. He had only nodded, because his mother's eyes had been shining with unshed tears, and because the pen in her hand had trembled as she pressed the crimson wax seal onto the envelope. "Promise me," she had whispered. "Promise me on the swallow." And the boy had touched the small enamel swallow pinned to his mother's collar, the swallow she had worn since childhood, the symbol of a soul that flew free, and he had whispered his promise into the still, dust-scented air of the library. 3 weeks later, she was gone. Back in the Abbey, Catherine turned to William and spoke 3 words, only 3. Her voice was low, growly, trembling at the edges but iron at the core. "It's the tiara." William's face drained of color, his knuckles whitened around the edge of the pew. For a long, suffocating moment, he did not move, and then he did. He stepped forward, past his wife, past the row of stunned dignitaries, and he raised one gloved hand toward the Archbishop with a gesture so subtle, so aristocratic, so utterly devoid of theatrics, that it might have been mistaken for a blessing. But it was not a blessing, it was a command. The Archbishop fell silent mid-sentence. The organ, which had begun a soft processional, faded into a strangled murmur and then died. Camilla, halfway to the altar, stopped. Her face, framed by the impossible glitter of Diana's diadem, betrayed the first flicker of confusion. And then, in a slower, more devastating instant, the first flicker of dawning horror. She had not known. That much was suddenly terrifyingly clear. She had not selected the tiara herself. Someone had selected it for her. The trap had been set. In the control room, Edward Hollis was frantically stabbing at his console. Cut the feed, cut the feed, cut the bloody feed. But the signal held. Somewhere deep inside the palace communications apparatus, a failsafe had been triggered. A failsafe that had been programmed, encrypted, and buried into the Abbey's broadcast infrastructure, not by the men in gray, but by someone else entirely. Someone who had anticipated this exact moment. Someone who had, 26 years ago, sealed a letter with crimson wax and whispered a promise to a 9-year-old boy. The satellite uplinks held. The feed continued. And across the world, 22 million viewers watched as the Princess of Wales stepped out of the second row and walked, slowly, deliberately, with the poise of a woman who had rehearsed this moment in her nightmares for a decade, toward the center of the sanctuary. She stopped 3 paces from Queen Camilla. She did not speak. She did not need to. She simply looked, once, at the diadem, the 17 pear-shaped diamonds, the sapphire cabochon at the center, the delicate platinum scrollwork that no jeweler in London had reproduced since 1994. And then she looked at William. And William nodded, just once, a slow, grave, devastating nod, and in that single silent exchange, the ceremony ended, not by announcement, not by fanfare, but by the quiet, unassailable authority of a mother's 26-year-old promise finally, at last, coming due. The Archbishop cleared his throat, glanced desperately at the row of courtiers, and then, with the trembling voice of a man who had suddenly realized he was standing at the epicenter of history, announced that the anniversary ceremony would be briefly suspended for a matter of protocol. The words fell into the abbey like stones into a well. The dignitaries did not move, the choir did not sing, the organ did not play. And in the transept, the man at the center of the men in gray, the invisible architect, the shadow who had operated inside the palace for 4 decades, the courtier whose name Diana had written in her own hand on the 7th of August 1997, turned on his polished Oxford heel and walked, with unhurried menace, toward the north exit. His name in the letter had been circled twice. The story of that letter began not in 1997, but in the autumn of 1995, when Diana had first begun to suspect that the machinery of the palace had ceased to protect her and had begun, instead, to systematically dismantle her. She had noticed the small things first, the sudden reassignment of her most trusted protection officer, the mysterious cancellation of her private telephone line, the way certain courtiers would fall silent when she entered a room. And then, in the winter of that year, she had commissioned the tiara. She had not done so for vanity. She had done so as a statement. She had chosen the swallow motif, hidden deliberately within the platinum scrollwork on the underside of the band, invisible to any casual observer, as a private symbol, a signature, a failsafe. If the tiara ever appeared in public on the head of a Windsor woman after her death, it would mean one thing, and one thing only. The men in gray had breached the vault at Althorpe. They had violated her final written instructions, and they had done so as an act of deliberate, calculated symbolic warfare against her sons. Catherine had learned of the letter in the spring of 2011, 3 weeks before her wedding. William had taken her, one quiet Sunday afternoon, to the Kensington Palace Library, the same library where his mother had sealed the envelope 14 years earlier, and he had shown her the copy that had been entrusted to him on his 18th birthday. She had read it in silence. She had read it twice. And then she had looked up at the man she was about to marry, and she had said, in a voice that trembled but did not break, "I will help you keep the promise." She had meant it. For 14 years, she had meant it. And now, in the vaulted silence of Westminster Abbey, with the eyes of the world upon her and the machinery of the crown grinding to a halt around her, she was keeping it. The antique rotary phone in the private office of the Prince of Wales, a phone that had not rung in 6 years, a phone connected to a single encrypted line that only 3 living people knew existed, began to ring. It rang in the Abbey office, its brass bell echoing through the corridor with a sound so anachronistic, so out of place, that the aide standing beside it visibly flinched. He picked up the receiver with trembling hands. "Your Royal Highness," he whispered into the mouthpiece, though there was no one on the other end yet. There was only static, the long hollow static of a satellite connection being established across an ocean. And then a voice that had once belonged to a laughing red-haired boy in the gardens of Highgrove. A voice now stripped of sovereign authority, stripped of ceremony, stripped of everything but the raw, cracked grief of a man who had just watched, from 6,000 miles away, his brother's wife halt the monarchy on his mother's behalf. "Is it done?" Prince Harry asked. His voice was the broken sob of a 15-year-old boy who had walked behind his mother's coffin. "Is it finally done?" The aide, tears streaming down his face, could only whisper one word into the receiver. "Yes." The trap had closed. Deep inside the palace's cryptographic archive, a vaulted chamber beneath Buckingham Palace that contained the encoded records of every royal correspondence dating back to the reign of Queen Victoria, a hidden compartment inside a mahogany desk drawer clicked open. The mechanism had been triggered remotely, activated by the same failsafe that had held the broadcast feed. Inside the compartment lay a single object, a silver cipher key, tarnished with age, engraved with the outline of a swallow in flight. It was the key to the second letter. The letter Diana had written not in 1997, but in the final week of her life. The letter that named in precise detail every operation, every conspiracy, every calculated cruelty that the men in gray had orchestrated against her. The letter that had been referenced in her earlier correspondence but never located. The letter that MI6 archivists had spent 3 decades quietly searching for. The letter that had been hidden, all along, inside a false-bottom compartment in a jewel box at Althorpe. A jewel box that contained, among other things, the tiara that Queen Camilla was, at that very moment, still wearing in Westminster Abbey. Millions of screens flickered simultaneously across the United Kingdom. The BBC's live commentator, a veteran royal correspondent with 30 years of experience, had fallen entirely silent. In her earpiece, her producer was screaming for her to say something, anything, but she could not. She could only stare at the monitor, at the frozen tableau inside the Abbey. Catherine standing 3 paces from Camilla, William beside her, the men in grey in retreat, and she could only think of the letter she herself had received, anonymously, in the post 3 days earlier. A single sheet of cream-colored paper, a single line of type. Watch the tiara. She had dismissed it. Now she understood. 20 million people were watching live. The servers holding the encrypted broadcast were straining under the load. Every social media platform on Earth was simultaneously grinding toward collapse. Camilla, still frozen in the center of the sanctuary, slowly raised one trembling hand toward the diadem upon her head. Her eyes had filled with tears. Real tears. Not the polished ceremonial tears of state occasions, but the raw, humiliated tears of a woman who had in that instant understood that she had been used. That someone inside her own household, someone she had trusted, had placed this specific tiara upon her head, this specific morning, knowing precisely what would happen. She had been the instrument, not the architect, the instrument, and the architect, she now understood with sickening clarity, was walking away through the north transept in polished Oxford shoes. Catherine finally spoke. Her voice, when it came, was not raised. It did not need to be. The vaulted acoustics of the Abbey carried every syllable with the clarity of a cathedral bell. For 26 years, she said, and her gloved hands trembled at her sides. The world has spoken for her. Today I am speaking for her. A collective intake of breath rippled through the Abbey. William's eyes closed. A single tear tracked down his cheek. This tiara, Catherine continued, her voice growly, weighted, trembling but iron, was never meant to be worn again. She wrote it in her own hand. She sealed it with her own wax. She entrusted it to her sons. And someone in this room, someone still operating inside these walls today, has spent 30 years working to undo that promise. She turned slowly and looked directly at the north transept. The man in the charcoal suit had stopped walking. He was frozen in the archway, his hand still on the door. "We know your name," Catherine said. She did not speak it. She did not need to. Every camera in the Abbey had already caught his face, and within 12 minutes, that face would be identified by an independent forensic archivist working from a scanned copy of Diana's 1997 letter. A copy that had, mysteriously, appeared on the desk of every major newspaper editor in London that same morning. They were cornered. The letter, when it was finally read aloud 3 hours later on a BBC emergency broadcast, contained passages so precise, so mathematically prophetic, that even the most skeptical royal historians would spend the following weeks in stunned silence. Diana had written, in her own trembling hand, on the 7th of August 1997, "If ever the tiara appears upon the head of C, on the anniversary of the coronation, know that it is the final signal. Know that he is still there. Know that he has not stopped. And know that my Catherine, the one who will come after me, the one William will love, will be the one to end it. She will halt it. She will name it. She will free the swallow." The date Diana had specified, the anniversary of a coronation that would not occur for another 26 years, the anniversary of a queen consort who was, in 1997, still legally married to another man, was mathematically impossible to have guessed. And yet she had guessed it. Not guessed, named. She had not just predicted this exact moment. She had named the exact person. She had named the exact tiara. She had named the exact courtier. And she had named the exact daughter-in-law who would at last deliver the reckoning. Inside the Abbey, William stepped forward and gently, with fingers that trembled with a grief 26 years old, lifted the diadem from Camilla's head. He did not do so cruelly. He did so with the sorrowful tenderness of a son finally reclaiming his mother's belongings from the machinery that had stolen them. Camilla, weeping openly now, did not resist. She lowered her head. She whispered something that no camera caught, an apology perhaps, or a plea, and William nodded once, gravely, in acknowledgement. He turned, holding the tiara in both hands as if it were made of glass, and he walked back to Catherine. Together, they placed the diadem into a small mahogany box that had been carried into the Abbey that morning by a Spencer family aide. A box that Earl Spencer himself, seated in the third row, had personally couriered from Althorpe House at dawn. The box closed with a soft mechanical click. The swallow was going home. Buckingham Palace's press office went dark within 40 minutes, not silent, dark. Every phone line was diverted to voicemail. Every scheduled statement was pulled. Every social media account froze mid-post. The men in grey, or what remained of them, had scattered. The senior courtier who had orchestrated the tiara selection, A man whose name we may not print here for reasons of ongoing legal proceedings, but whose face was, within hours, matched by forensic biometric experts to a figure who had appeared in 3 private photographs from Kensington Palace in the summer of 1996, had already boarded a private aircraft bound for a jurisdiction with no extradition treaty. He would never return. His 40-year career of shadow architecture, of quiet manipulations, of calculated cruelties against a princess who had trusted him, had ended in the 11-second walk from the sanctuary to the North Transept Archway. Prince Harry landed at Heathrow 6 hours later. He did not board a commercial flight. He boarded a private plane. He was met on the tarmac not by aides, not by protection officers, not by the customary reception of a returning royal, but by his brother. William stood alone on the wet asphalt beneath a light drizzle, his coat collar turned up against the cold, his hands buried in his pockets. Harry stepped off the plane and stopped, 5 feet from his brother, and for a long, agonizing moment neither man spoke. And then Harry said, his voice cracked, "Mum was right." And William, tears streaming freely down his face, said she was always right. And the 2 brothers, separated for years by the ruthless machinery of the palace, by the calculated engineering of the men in gray, by every fabricated feud and manipulated headline, embraced on the tarmac in the rain. The photograph, taken by a single freelance photographer who had been tipped off by an anonymous source, an unnamed loyalist deep inside the institution, would be printed on the front page of every newspaper in the world the following morning. Catherine returned to Kensington Palace that evening. She did not speak to the press. She did not release a statement. She walked, alone, into the library where William's mother had once paced before the tall mullioned windows, and she sat down in the same wing-back chair that Diana had favored. On the mahogany desk before her lay the small box containing the tiara. She did not open it. She simply rested one gloved hand upon its lid, and she closed her eyes. And she whispered a single sentence into the still, dust-scented air of the library. The same room, the same air, the same silence that had witnessed a promise made 26 years earlier by a 9-year-old boy. "It's done," she whispered. "You can rest now." And somewhere in the deep, sacred stillness of the room, a single dust mote drifted through a shaft of pale evening light, a mote so small, so weightless, so fleeting that it might have been mistaken, by a woman with tears in her eyes, for the swift, silent flight of a swallow. Earl Spencer received the mahogany box at Althorpe House shortly before midnight. He did not open it either. He carried it, alone, down the long stone corridor that led to the family crypt, and he placed it upon the marble ledge beside his sister's tomb. He rested one hand upon the cold stone. "You were right, Diana," he said, his voice cracking. "You were always right, and they finally heard you." He turned, and he walked out of the crypt, and he closed the great oak door behind him. The tiara would never again be worn. It would never again be displayed. It would rest from that night forward, beside the woman who had commissioned it, beside the woman who had named the swallow, beside the woman whose voice had at last, at long, agonizing last, been heard. In Westminster Abbey, the great stained glass windows had gone dark, the candles had been extinguished, the dignitaries had departed. Only the Archbishop remained, standing alone before the high altar, his hands clasped, his lips moving in silent prayer. The Coronation Anniversary, the polished, choreographed, meticulously engineered celebration of duty and unity and royal continuity, had ended not with a triumphant procession but with the quiet, devastating reckoning of a promise finally kept. The nation had watched, the world had watched, and nothing from that moment forward would ever be the same. Across pubs in Edinburgh, pint glasses were finally raised. Across drawing rooms in Kensington, teacups were set down with hands that trembled with something more complicated than grief. Across the darkened suburbs of a country that had for 26 years mourned a princess it had never fully known, millions of people wept, for Diana, for William, for Harry, and for the mother-in-law who had finally at last spoken the truth on her behalf. The broadcast cut to black. There was no music. There was no commentary. There was only the final, unadorned image of the Princess of Wales walking alone down the length of Westminster Abbey's darkened nave, the mahogany box held reverently in her gloved hands, her cream-colored gown catching the last thin light of a dying English afternoon. And then the screen went dark. The truth had saved her boys. The swallow had finally flown free. The secret was out. And across a stunned, silent nation, no one spoke.